In Part 5 of our ISO 27001 ISMS implementation series, we now move into the operational phase of the management system. Up to this point, we've explored organizational context, leadership commitment, risk planning, and the support structures required to make the system function. Now we focus on where the ISMS becomes real. This is the point where risk decisions turn into action, where policies become operational practices, where controls are implemented, and where governance translates into accountability. Clause 8 is where planning meets organizational reality. It's where the effectiveness of the management system is truly tested, not on paper but in day-to-day operations. In this session, we'll examine how operational planning, risk assessment, and risk treatment are carried out in practice, and how they generate the evidence that demonstrates the ISMS is functioning as intended. A recap on the Information Security Management System. Clauses 4 through 10 form the mandatory management system framework. They guide how the organization establishes context, demonstrates leadership, plans risk management activities, provides support, operates the system, evaluates performance, and drives continual improvement. You can see the progression from understanding the organization and its environment in Clause 4 through leadership and planning into operational execution in Clause 8, and finally into monitoring and improvement in Clauses 9 and 10. Annex A sits beneath this framework as the set of risk-based information security controls. These controls are not standalone requirements, they are selected based on risk decisions and implemented through the management system itself. The key point is that Annex A controls operate within the structure defined by Clauses 4 to 10. The management system provides governance and direction, Annex A provides the control mechanisms. Together, they form a structured, risk-driven system designed to operate, adapt, and improve over time. Clause 8 builds directly on Clauses 4 to 7. By this stage, the organization has defined its context, demonstrated leadership commitment, planned its risk approach, and ensured the necessary resources, competence, and documentation are in place. Clause 8 is where all of that preparation turns into execution. It executes what was planned and enabled. Risk treatment plans are implemented. Controls are put into operation. Processes are followed. Responsibilities become active rather than theoretical. And most importantly, Clause 8 creates operational evidence. This is where the management system generates records, logs, outputs, and traceability that demonstrate the ISMS is functioning in practice. If Clauses 4 to 7 design and enable the system, Clause 8 proves that it is operating. Clause 8 is such a pivotal part of the management system. First, risk decisions become operational tasks. The risks that were identified and evaluated in planning now translate into specific actions, controls, and responsibilities. Second, governance turns into ownership. Leadership direction and policy commitments move beyond statements and into accountable execution by control owners and operational teams. Third, documentation becomes behavior. Procedures are no longer documents on a shared drive, they are followed, applied, and evidenced in daily operations. And finally, plans meet organizational reality. This is where theory encounters practical constraints, competing priorities, resource limitations, and cultural dynamics. Clause 8 is where the system either adapts and functions or struggles to take hold. In essence, Clause 8 determines whether the ISMS is simply designed or genuinely operating. The reality of Clause 8, and why it is often the hardest phase of ISMS implementation. On paper, Clause 8 is straightforward: implement what was planned. In practice, this is where organizational complexity becomes visible. There are competing priorities across departments. Security is rarely the only initiative. Teams are balancing operational targets, customer demands, and performance metrics alongside control implementation. There are limited resources against an ambitious scope. What was strategically approved may be operationally constrained. There is often political resistance to change. New controls can be perceived as additional workload, loss of autonomy, or disruption to established ways of working. And finally, controls impact day-to-day work. They change processes, introduce approvals, enforce monitoring, and sometimes slow things down. Clause 8 is not difficult because of the standard. It is difficult because it requires alignment, negotiation, prioritization, and leadership in a live organizational environment. This is where understanding organizational dynamics while building momentum becomes essential. Clause 8 does not operate in isolation. It is driven by the combined outputs of clauses 4 to 7. Clause 4 defines the ISMS scope, organizational context, and the needs and expectations of interested parties. This sets the boundaries and strategic environment within which the ISMS must operate. Clause 5 provides leadership direction. It establishes policy, accountability, and management commitment, ensuring there is authority behind the system. Clause 6 translates that direction into risk decisions. It produces risk assessment results, treatment plans, selected controls, and operational objectives. Clause 7 ensures the system is enabled. Resources are assigned, competence is developed, awareness is delivered, communication is structured, and documented information is controlled. Clause 8 is then driven by all of these combined outputs. It translates strategic intent, risk decisions, and support capability into operational control execution. In other words, Clause 8 is where everything designed and enabled in Clauses 4 through 7 becomes operational reality. The structure of Clause 8 into its three core components. Clause 8.1 focuses on operational planning and control. This is about ensuring that ISMS processes are planned, implemented, and controlled in line with the requirements. It ensures that what was designed in earlier clauses is actively managed in operation. Clause 8.2 addresses information security risk assessment. Risk is not a one-time activity. This subclause requires the organization to perform risk assessments at planned intervals and when significant changes occur. It keeps the system dynamic and responsive. Clause 8.3 covers information security risk treatment. This is where risk treatment plans are implemented. Selected controls are applied, risk responses are executed, and documented information is retained as evidence. Together, these three elements ensure that the ISMS is not static. It operates, adapts, and produces evidence of effectiveness. Clause 8.1 is where the ISMS becomes operational. It moves us from planning into execution. First, we plan the processes. We define the operational processes required for the ISMS, link them directly to the actions determined in Clause 6, and establish measurable criteria so we know whether those processes are working effectively. Second, we implement and control those processes. It's not enough to design them, they must operate according to defined criteria consistently and repeatably. Controls must be embedded into day-to-day activities, and adherence must be monitored. Third, we maintain documented confidence. We retain sufficient documented information to demonstrate that processes were executed as planned. This provides evidence for audit, management review, and ongoing assurance, including evidence of reassessment where needed. Fourth, we control change. Planned changes must be managed formally. We assess unintended consequences and mitigate adverse effects. This is one of the most critical areas in practice, and one of the most common audit findings. Finally, we control external providers. Outsourced processes and suppliers must be governed. Third-party controls must align with ISMS requirements, and contractual and monitoring oversight must be maintained. In simple terms, Clause 8.1 ensures that what was planned in Clause 6 is actually controlled in practice. When auditors assess Clause 8.1, they are evaluating operational discipline, not just documentation. First, they expect evidence that processes are clearly defined and controlled. They want to see structured ISMS operational processes, defined criteria for how those processes are measured, assigned roles and responsibilities, and controls embedded into daily operations. Second, they expect a clear link back to Clause 6, risk-based planning. Operational processes must align to risk treatment decisions. There must be traceability from risk to selected control to operational execution. If that linkage is missing, it raises questions about governance. Third, they expect documented information that provides confidence. This includes logs, records, change approvals, monitoring reports, and review evidence. Not excessive paperwork, but enough to demonstrate that processes are carried out as planned. Fourth, they scrutinize change management. This is one of the most common areas of audit weakness. Auditors will look for formal change processes, risk impact assessments before implementation, review of unintended consequences, and evidence of mitigation actions. Finally, they expect control over external providers. Supplier security requirements must be defined, reflected in contracts, monitored over time, and reassessed when changes occur. In summary, auditors are asking a simple but critical question. Is the ISMS operationally controlled, risk-aligned, and evidenced in practice? Clause 8.2 reinforces that risk assessment is not a one-time activity, it is an ongoing operational requirement. First, risk assessments must be performed at planned intervals. This ensures the organization periodically reassesses its risk landscape rather than relying on outdated assumptions. Second, risk assessments must also be performed when significant changes occur. Changes to technology, suppliers, business processes, legal requirements, or organizational structure can all alter the risk profile. Clause 8.2 ensures that the ISMS remains responsive. Third, the organization must apply the criteria defined earlier in Clause 6.1.2. This maintains consistency. The same methodology, risk criteria, and evaluation approach must be used, ensuring risk decisions are structured and repeatable. Finally, documented risk assessment results must be retained. Evidence matters. The organization must be able to demonstrate what was assessed, how it was evaluated, and what conclusions were reached. In essence, Clause 8.2 ensures that risk assessment becomes an operational discipline, systematic, triggered by change, aligned to defined criteria, and supported by documented evidence. When auditors assess Clause 8.2, they are not just looking for a risk register, they are looking for evidence of discipline and consistency. First, they want evidence of updated risk assessments. They will check whether risk assessments are current and whether they have been reviewed at planned intervals. Second, they look for a clear link to change triggers. If there have been system migrations, supplier changes, organizational restructuring, or regulatory updates, auditors will expect to see that risk assessments were performed in response to those changes. Third, they look for consistent application of risk criteria. The organization must apply the methodology and criteria defined earlier in planning. Risk scoring should be structured, repeatable, and aligned to defined thresholds. Finally, they expect retained and approved records. Risk assessment results should be documented, traceable, and formally approved where required. There must be clear evidence of review and decision-making. In short, auditors are assessing whether risk assessment is a controlled, repeatable process, not an informal or reactive exercise. Clause 8.3 focuses on risk treatment, turning assessment decisions into concrete action. First, the organization must implement the approved risk treatment plan. This means executing what was formally agreed during the risk evaluation stage. Treatment plans cannot remain theoretical, they must be actioned. Second, selected controls must be applied. These controls may come from Annex A or other sources, but they must directly address the identified risks and be implemented in practice. Third, there must be alignment between risks, controls, and the statement of applicability. The SOA should accurately reflect which controls are selected, why they are selected, and how they link back to assessed risks. This traceability is critical for audit and governance. Finally, evidence of treatment results must be retained. The organization must demonstrate that controls were implemented and that risk levels were reduced to acceptable residual levels. Documentation, approvals, and records provide that assurance. In essence, Clause 8.3 ensures that risk treatment is deliberate, traceable, and evidenced, not assumed. When auditors evaluate Clause 8.3, they are assessing whether risk treatment is genuinely implemented, not just documented. First, they look for evidence that treatment actions have been completed. It's not enough to have a risk treatment plan. Auditors will verify whether the agreed actions were actually carried out. Second, they assess whether controls are operational and effective. They may sample configurations, review logs, interview control owners, or test processes to confirm that controls are functioning in practice. Third, they examine whether evidence is clearly aligned to identified risks. There must be traceability from risk assessment to selected controls, and from controls to operational evidence. The linkage should be structured and defensible. Finally, they look for consistency between the plan and reality. There should be no gap between what was documented in the treatment plan and what exists operationally. The statement of applicability, risk register, and implemented controls must all align. In essence, auditors are confirming that risk treatment is complete, operational, traceable, and evidenced, ensuring that the ISMS is functioning as designed. This slide provides a practical example of how Clause 8 evidence can be structured across the ISMS. Rather than treating operational control, risk reassessment, and risk treatment as isolated activities, this matrix shows how they connect to specific controls and management system clauses. For each control area, such as access control, identity management, supplier security, logging, backup, or vulnerability management, we can identify 3 layers of evidence. First, Clause 8.1 evidence. This demonstrates that the process is operationally controlled, for example, access reviews, change approvals, supplier monitoring records, or backup test results. Second, Clause 8.2 evidence. This shows that risk reassessment occurs when triggers arise, such as role changes, restructuring, major findings, scope updates, or resource constraints. Third, Clause 8.3 evidence. This confirms that treatment actions were implemented, MFA enforced, lifecycle controls applied, contractual clauses implemented, patching performed, or controls updated in the statement of applicability. The matrix also extends beyond Annex A controls to include management system clauses, such as scope changes, context updates, governance shifts, methodology updates, objectives, resources, and documented information. This is important because Clause 8 is not only about technical controls. It is about ensuring that operational execution, risk reassessment, and treatment actions are consistently applied across the entire ISMS. In practice, this kind of matrix demonstrates traceability, alignment, and audit readiness, showing that there is no disconnect between risk, control selection, and operational evidence. Under Clause 6, planning, auditors assess why controls were selected or excluded. They focus on risk treatment decisions and justification. There must be traceability from organizational context to risk assessment, from risk to selected control, and from control to the SOA. In other words, Clause 6 answers the question, why was this control chosen? Under Clause 8, operation, the focus shifts. Auditors now test whether the selected controls are implemented and operating. Controls are sampled directly from the SOA. The SOA effectively becomes the auditor's checklist. They will select controls and request evidence that they are functioning in practice. They review operational evidence, configurations, logs, records, approvals, monitoring reports to confirm effectiveness. In simple terms, Clause 6 asks why the control was chosen. Clause 8 asks whether the control actually works. Together, this creates alignment between risk decisions and operational reality, and this is where many organizations either demonstrate maturity or reveal gaps. The most common Clause 8 audit findings in practice. The first is risks not being reassessed after change. Organizations implement system updates, migrate platforms, onboard suppliers, or restructure teams, but the risk assessment is not revisited. This creates a gap between operational reality and documented risk. The second is overdue risk treatment actions. Treatment plans are approved, but actions are delayed, partially implemented, or left open without formal review. Auditors look closely at target dates and accountability. The third common finding is controls selected but not implemented. Controls may appear in the statement of applicability, but operational evidence does not support that they are active or effective. And finally, missing or inconsistent evidence. Logs may not be retained, approvals may be informal, records may be incomplete, or documentation may not align with what is actually happening in practice. Most Clause 8 findings are not about the absence of documentation, they are about misalignment between plan and operation. Clause 8 exposes whether the ISMS is truly embedded or simply documented. Clause 8 produces tangible outputs, and these outputs demonstrate whether the ISMS is truly operational. First, it generates operational evidence of controls. Logs, approvals, monitoring reports, access reviews, configuration records, these show that controls are functioning in practice. Second, it produces updated risk assessments. As changes occur and risks are reassessed, the risk register evolves. This ensures the system remains aligned to the current risk environment. Third, it results in implemented risk treatment actions. Approved treatment plans are executed, controls are applied, and residual risks are formally accepted where appropriate. And finally, Clause 8 feeds directly into Clause 9. Performance data, risk status updates, control effectiveness evidence, and treatment progress become inputs for monitoring, measurement, internal audit, and management review. In simple terms, Clause 8 turns planning into performance and provides the evidence needed to evaluate effectiveness and drive improvement. As we close Part 5, one thing becomes clear: operational execution is only part of the journey. Clause 8 challenges organizations to turn planning into action and action into evidence. But sustaining that momentum requires more than processes, it requires understanding organizational dynamics. Building momentum while navigating competing priorities, resource constraints, and change resistance becomes critical at this stage. This is where the ISMS either embeds into the culture or remains a compliance exercise. In Part 6, we move into the next phase, proving that the ISMS works in practice. We will explore performance evaluation, how monitoring, measurement, internal audit, and management review demonstrate effectiveness and drive improvement. Because ultimately, it's not enough to implement controls. The organization must be able to show clearly and confidently that the ISMS delivers value.